Welcome. If you're a woman who has a sense that there's more out there for you, you're in the right place. I'm Whitney Baker, host of the Electric Ideas podcast. Somewhere along the line of work and kids, life carried on, but I lost track of my truth. I'm on a reflective journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. Each week, I interview a woman who is lighting her own path and offering others hope. Before our conversation ends, we'll share a reflective question for you to explore. Sometimes all we need is a jolt, a fresh idea, an aha moment that connects us to a sense of possibility. This, my friends, is what I call an electric idea. Welcome back to Electric Ideas. I'm your host, Whitney Baker. Today, we have a Valentine's Day week replay, a conversation that has become a fan favorite and is one I believe is truly empowering for women. We're diving into a topic that not all women feel comfortable being vocal about: women's sexual health and pleasure. And with my esteemed guest, Dr. Lori Brotto, we're exploring how mindfulness can play a powerful role in both. Dr. Brotto is an expert voice in this space. She's a professor at the University of British Columbia and executive director of the Women's Health Research Institute. It's quite possible you've encountered Dr. Brotto's work in some popular documentaries, including Netflix's The Principles of Pleasure or CBC Gem's The Big Sex Talk. She also wrote a super compelling book that I enjoyed called Better Sex Through Mindfulness, and that is a lot of what we are going to explore today. It's full of science-backed, practical resources that show how mindfulness practices can help women feel more connected to their bodies. Whether you're new to this conversation or revisiting it this week, I'm confident you're going to have a lot of fresh takeaways. Let's get into it. Hi, Dr. Brotto. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to dive right in because I know while there are some physical factors that can impede a woman's ability to enjoy sex as she ages, your book and your research bear out that a lot of sexual dysfunction is more in the mind. So I want to start there. Tell us about this.
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity. And I'm so glad we're talking about women's sexual health, because what we know from the large surveys that have been done, that quite a lot of women really struggle in this domain. So the big studies suggest that probably 1 in 3 women will report a difficulty with their sexual pleasure or response or function, low desire, not feeling pleasure, difficulty reaching orgasm, pain with sex. And despite how common it is, it's still pretty taboo. Right. So most people who have difficulties don't seek help. They are embarrassed to talk to a primary care provider, and the vast majority simply don't get the help that they deserve. And so given how common it is, it has led to researchers to really try and understand what's at the root of these difficulties. Why are they so common? And some might even speculate that they're becoming more prevalent with time. And, of course, that's a scientific question: are they becoming more prevalent, or are we just measuring them better and we're reporting them out better? My own view as someone who's, really deeply in this space, both as a researcher as well as a clinician, is I actually do think that sexual concerns are becoming more prevalent. And at one time we used to think, among women or birth assigned females, that it was, related to menopause and the older stage, and there's age related issues on a more medical biological level that are contributing. But in fact, we actually know that a lot of young people also really struggle when it comes to their sexual response. So in turn, it's led researchers to say, what is going on? And of course, there definitely are biological components. We know that concurrent use of medications like antidepressants or some anti-seizure medications or other medications can contribute to blunted sexual arousal and desire. Surgeries similarly can have that impact. But when we look on the whole at the major contributors, it does turn out that more psychological and social and environmental factors carry most of the weight. So in my book, the first one, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, I talk a lot about the role of stress, the role of the never-ending chronic day-to-day to-do list, the feeling of anxiety that comes about when you feel like you can never get ahead on things, the multitasking, the difficulties with attention. And then there's the overt, much more psychological contributors like high rates of depression, anxiety. 1 in 3 women have a history of trauma, body image issues, and all of these factors directly contribute to difficulties with sexual desire.
Thank you. That's like a perfect overview. And I think it's really helpful that you point out that only a fraction of women with sexual dysfunction or challenges speak up and feel comfortable. And that's part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation. How does stress, you mentioned that, and I know this is a big one you talk about in your show, whether work, kids, that endless mental load that you talk a lot about in the book, how does that impact sexual desire and intimacy for women?
Yeah. And, stress comes in many different forms. There's, stress at a physiological or a hormonal or a neuroendocrine level, which can be characterized as very high levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, can also be characterized by the body's inability to cope in the face of a stressor. So historically or prehistorically, our brains and our bodies were programmed to help us combat and face a stressor or run really, really fast. That's the nature of the fight or flight response. And so our brain is still very much wired to cope with stressors in that way, either by allowing us, having the blood flow to the parts of our body that will allow us to be strong and fight and run towards the threat, or run as fast as we can away from it. And the problem today is that our stressors are very different, that the things that people report being stressed about very much have to do with the chronic things that are happening every day. There's too much on the to-do list. How can I get all of the things done that I need to get done to have a family, if you choose to have a family, and work full time, because the cost of living is becoming more and more unaffordable, where it's almost rare, let's say in a dual parent home, to have one person who's not working because we simply can't afford to do that. And then there's all of the mundane things on our to-do list, making sure that we've filled out permission forms, making sure that we're volunteering, we're contributing to society. There's health and wellness, there's all of the other things. And it really contributes on a more psychological level, feeling like you're on that never-ending hamster wheel. And that also contributes to our physiology. So it's a psychological mechanism of feeling like, oh, there's too much to do, I can't get through it. But because brain and body are one and intertwined and interconnected, it doesn't just stay in a psychological place. It has a direct translation into the body. So you see impacts on our ability to fight off illness. You see impacts on our fatigue levels. You see impacts on being prone to diseases or other ailments. And so all of that kind of amounts to stress. And so stress is a major contributor to low desire. There's also the impacts of stress on just ability to be present and pay attention. And I think a lot of people still maybe adopt the belief that, well, isn't sex just automatic, right? Like you're in the mood, you start engaging, you press the right buttons and arousal happens and everyone is satisfied. And hopefully in the very kind of terse way I'm presenting it, your listeners are feeling like, well, no, it doesn't happen that way. In reality, maybe in some erotic art forms it does, but not in reality, that we need to be intentional. We need to be present. We need to take socks off. We need to lock doors. We need to make sure, kids are not walking in. We need to make sure that there's safe protection mechanisms, all of those things. And so the mind is very much an active agent in whether a person has desire and arousal. And so if the mind is elsewhere, if it's preoccupied, if it's distracted, if it's worried, it's also going to directly impede the response that happens in the moment during sex. So there's this kind of global effect of day-to-day stress on just our energy and ability levels and mental health. And then there's the in-the-moment effects of stress that make sex less pleasurable.
I want to dive into a couple things that you said in there. One, I think it is a common reality for women to be lying next to their partner in bed and want to have sex, but have that mental train. And I think a lot of women would say that men have a different ability to just kind of flip that switch. Mm-hmm. And women maybe don't experience that, but I think it's very relatable. So I'm wondering if from a practical perspective, we can talk about practices that women could explore in order to help mitigate the monkey mind and put herself in a position of presence to actually be connected with her body and present and more open to sex. Secondly, something you talk about in your book is how it's a little bit misguided that desire, that feeling of desire has to precede sex. So I'm wondering if you could also speak into that a little bit more too.
Yeah, great questions. And I'm gonna start by answering the second question because I think it feeds into the first. And the second question is, first of all, we need to acknowledge and accept, and a lot of research has supported this, that for most of us, males and females, and in particular, if you're in a longer term relationship, we don't walk around with spontaneous feelings of desire where we out of the blue feel like we want to have sex. That just doesn't happen much more likely at the start of a relationship. And certainly there may be times, let's say, there's some females who mid-cycle at ovulation do feel a bit more of that kind of innate wanting, that spontaneous desire, but it's rare for the vast majority of people. And so we meaning kind of sex therapists or people who provide service in this space, often advocate for planning. And I often say to my own clients, and when I give talks, what else do you do in your life that is important, that is of value, that is meaningful to you, that is not planned? And yet with sex, we expect it to be totally spontaneous. And if it's not spontaneous, it's clinical and boring and dry and, planned out. And I think that narrative needs to be dismantled, because when you can plan it, first of all, you can plan it for a time when you're more likely to be present, when you're more likely to be awake. I mean, and I know because I talk to a lot of couples, the number of people that have sex like after the 11 p.m. news, right? As kind of like a checklist item. It's still spontaneous, but it's happening at a time where, the gas tank is empty, so to speak. There's no mental or physical energy to really contribute to this activity that really requires awakeness, not sleepiness. So that's the first piece is, if we can have intention around scheduling sex. Now that of course requires you to say, why have sex in the first place, right? So if it's not for desire, what is in it for me? What is in it for my relationship? If you're in a relationship, what are the benefits that come about? And this also has been an area of a lot of research using the approach avoidance model of motivation to really understand what are the motivations that people provide. And it turns out there are 237 distinct reasons that people provide for why they have sex, totally distinct. So I often say to the people I work with, choose one of those reasons, have a handful of those reasons that you draw from when desire is not there, because chances are it won't be there. That you do need to think about, oh, I want to have sex because I feel so close to my partner after, or it helps me get to sleep, or I feel powerful after, or the orgasm on the other side feels really good. So regardless of what the reason is, there should be at least one reason that is about achieving something positive, not just avoiding something negative like a fight or conflict in a relationship. So you can see how I'm describing even just the planning of sex. It's intentional. It's drawing from reasons and then it's scheduling it accordingly.
Yeah, no, that resonates a lot with me because it's kind of like making space for something that's important to you. And we all have to do that. And that, you described the busyness and the hectic lives that many
Yeah.
modern women face. But I can understand this deeper layer if you're not clear on why it's important to you and it's become something that feels like an obligation or a should, or there's some shame, whatever, then you're probably less motivated. So
Yeah.
I definitely appreciate it. The other point that's coming up for me as you're talking about this, I think you made the analogy of like, if you really need water and the longer you go, you get thirstier and thirstier and you're like, whoa, I need water. And I'm paraphrasing here, but
Yeah.
it was kind of like with sex, that was not the same. Like for women, they got almost more used to just being like, oh, do I even need sex? Like the farther away
Correct.
they got it, it
Yeah.
was an opposite effect. Can you help us
Yeah.
understand that a little bit? Because I found that very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really taps into a very kind of old understanding of desire as being, and I still hear this to this day, sex is a basic human need. And much like water, if we don't get it, we have thirst and we crave it and we can't do anything else. In fact, our body starts shutting down if we don't get it. And then we get the water and everything is good. And that was the prevailing belief about desire for a long time. And I think maybe it comes from an evolutionary perspective, which is we do need sex for propagation of the species. Although it turns out we really don't, because there's lots of other ways for people to get pregnant besides penis and vagina intercourse. And IVF and other assisted reproductive technologies have taught us that not even sex is required for propagation of the species. So it is an outdated view. And so then what is desire? If it's not this innate hunger or thirst, what is it? And again, when we look at the emerging research, it suggests very strongly that desire is probably akin to other emotions. Like, let's take happiness as an example. When do we feel? I mean, of course, we all have predispositions to being on that happiness spectrum of, are we someone who's really, really cheery and happy most of the time, or someone who's not? But it's really, what are the things that are happening in the moment to elicit feelings of happiness? So you feel happy in the moment because a good thing has happened to you, right? Someone has made you a compliment, or something has happened, or you've heard a good news story, or you've played with your dog, in my case, and it makes you happy. Something has happened that has elicited happiness from you. And desire is very, very similar. In fact, so much so that many of us talk about responsive desire. And Rosemary Basson, brilliant family physician who has really specialized in sexual medicine and has done a lot of really important writing about desire, kind of didn't coin, but definitely resurrected this term responsive desire. And it recognizes that desire emerges in response to arousal, in response to triggers, in response to these other things. And so that's a really helpful view, I think, for all of us, but especially people who feel like they have low desire. And the approach, therefore, would be not, why do you have low desire, but rather, what is missing that is not eliciting this response? And what can we add back in to elicit this response?
Yes. And I think just having an open conversation that it's not assumed that your sexual desire is going to tank with age. I think that a lot of women probably don't raise their hand because they're just ho-hum, like this is part of getting older. Your book is very focused on how mindfulness is now a scientifically proven treatment for a lot of these sexual challenges. What is your definition of mindfulness? And can you give us some ideas of basic mindfulness practices that have helped women that maybe identify with that woman who's laying in bed with the racing mind, who wants to feel sexual desire and sexual connection? Can you give us an idea of some basic practices she could maybe explore to reconnect with her ability to be present?
Yeah, so I love the definition of mindfulness that arose from an international consensus of experts in mindfulness, practitioners and researchers and thinkers who came together many years ago, 2004, and said we need to settle on a definition of mindfulness because people are using it in slightly different ways. Is it meditation? Is it tantra? Is it transcendental? Like, what is it exactly? And so the definition that Bishop in 2004 and this international collaboration put together is that mindfulness is present moment, non-judgmental awareness. Okay, so it's awareness. Awareness is kind of the outcome that we achieve. And how do we get to awareness? Through doing two things. We pay attention on purpose. So that means guiding the attention onto a certain target, maybe the breath, maybe places in the body, maybe as we're eating something. So we're targeting the mind to pay attention. That's half of mindfulness. And the other half of it is how. How do we do that? And we do it non-judgmentally. So that means as we're paying attention to this piece of fruit as we're eating it, we're not beating ourselves up saying, oh, I have such a monkey mind, or, oh, this reminds me why I hate yoga, or I can't do this. My ADHD makes it impossible for me to pay attention. So we let go of that narrative of judgment, which is, I think is the harder part of mindfulness. The paying attention is the easier part. Letting go of judgment is the much harder part, because I think as a human species, we continually judge. We're continually sorting things into like and dislike, positive and negative, approach and avoidance, if you will. But that part of mindfulness, the how we go about doing it, is absolutely critical. It's not just enough to pay attention. So when we bring that definition now into the sexual domain, it makes so much sense why this practice would be useful. Why? Because we have high rates of inattention and distractibility that happen during sex, during a lot of people's sex, but especially among people who have difficulties with desire and arousal and other things. Lots and lots of studies have proven that attention plays a critical role in sexual response. So it makes sense that then that half of mindfulness would be useful there. But the judgment part and the practicing of compassion and kindness and non-judgment is also equally critical, because we also know from a lot of research in our clinical work that people who have sexual difficulties are incredibly self-critical. I'm broken. I'm incapable of feeling desire. Why can't I be like my friends? My partner will leave me because I don't have an adequate response. I'll never be a sexual person again after my breast cancer treatment, and on and on and on. And so these extreme self-judgments are very heavily intertwined with people's sexual difficulties. And again, because mindfulness is about the repeated practice of paying attention without judgment, it gives them a tool that they can use when those judgments arise during sex. And so the how now, which I think was your last question, how do we go about doing this? We start practicing, right? We carve out time every single day. And ideally, if you're new to this, we start out in a totally non-sexual way. You find your comfy sofa in the house or your comfy mat on the floor where you can get in a comfortable position, and maybe you follow a guide, a mindfulness guide for 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 minutes. That's a whole other area of research, is how much do we need to practice to benefit? And you start developing these skills. You start to cultivate that muscle in the brain of being able to pay attention non-judgmentally. And then once we have some skill with that, then we can bring that into the sexual arena. Maybe we start out through our own self-touch, right? So self-touch, not for the purposes of orgasm, but for the purposes of just exploring what things feel like. And then we borrow these skills and bring them in. And then we progressively move up to partnered sexual interactions where we're bringing those same skills in.
Yes. I mean, from personal experience, I would posit that cultivating a mindfulness practice in any capacity can positively impact many facets of life, but it just felt so right when you talked about it in support of sexual health. What advice do you have for women who can't get past that judgment and feel like their lack of confidence with their changing, perhaps, body is an inhibitor to relaxing and enjoying sex?
The first thing I would do is validate that, because people feel very broken when they have those feelings of, extreme dislike of one's body or other really firm beliefs about who you are and what you're capable of. So that's the first thing, is let's just acknowledge that that's there for you, that is there for you. But it's also important to remember that none of us were born with the beliefs that we have. We've acquired these beliefs about ourselves, about our body, about the world, our expectations through life experience, through our observation of other people, through influence of media and social media, through our firsthand experiences. We've developed these beliefs. So for the person with extremely low body image, there's been lots of studies that show people who live on isolated islands that have no contact with media or social media have no body image issues, right? So it's not that we're born with body image issues. It's these influences have cultivated those beliefs. So I think that's really reassuring to know that just like beliefs can come, beliefs can go, right? So that's, I think, a fundamental thing, is acknowledging, yeah, this feels really hard for you right now. And these feel so truthful, and almost like facts for you, but it wasn't always like that. Things have happened in your life to bring on these beliefs. The other thing is from a mindfulness perspective, is mindfulness addresses beliefs in a very different way than we're kind of used to in our day-to-day life, right? So if I have a belief, I'm a good person, I'm going to believe that that's a fact, right? That's going to carry weight for me. I'm going to rely on that belief. But the mindfulness perspective is that thoughts are just byproducts of brain activity. And sometimes the brain produces thoughts. By the way, in mindfulness, we call them mental events. Sometimes the brain produces these mental events that are factual, and sometimes it produces mental events that are not factual. And sometimes it produces mental events that have a bit of fact and a bit of fiction in them. So from that perspective, we can actually practice in our mindfulness practice, having a bit of a distance from thoughts as they're happening. And you can actually practice a practice called mindfulness of thoughts that involves observing thoughts as they're arising in your mind and just kind of noting them, saying, oh, there goes a judgment thought, there goes a memory thought, there goes a planning thought, without glomming onto them and believing that they are truth and fact. All this falls under the umbrella of something we call metacognition, and it's thinking about thinking. So hopefully that didn't get too jargony on your listeners, but the whole idea is that thoughts can come and go. Thoughts are not necessarily facts. And there's actually a lot we can do to manage, change, and let go of some of these very unhelpful thoughts.
I think that's actually really helpful. And it reminds me of something that stuck with me from your book that, you said something to the effect of the most important organ in our sex life, probably for women, is the brain. So it makes sense. And I appreciate that explanation. There's a long-standing double standard when it comes to sex that kind of teaches women to acquiesce rather than cultivate a sense of sexual agency. Can you talk a little bit about the research for men? I mean, everybody's familiar with Viagra, but I don't know that many people know about the research for women when it comes to sexual dysfunction. And I'm just wondering what you have to say about women kind of reclaiming their agency and their own pleasure in the equation of sex in this day and age.
Yeah, it's about damn time. That's what I say to that statement. It's about damn time. I mean, we still have the shackles of Freud in, mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, who classified women as either frigid, right? If you're not interested in desire enough, you're frigid, or this awful other, both terms are awful, or nymphomaniac, which is kind of like a disease for the woman who was, have had this overabundance of sex drive. And you were one or the other. There was, not this kind of enormous place in between. And I think that narrative about women being frigid or nymphomaniac carried on for decades, if not a century. And, you layer on top of that the fact that most scientists, up until arguably the current century, are male. Medical schools admitted mostly men. Textbooks were written mostly based on male anatomy. And so there was no kind of comparison. Like everything was compared to the male goalpost, so to speak. And so even when Viagra was approved in 1998 in the United States, 1999 in Canada, that was the year that I started doing human female sex research. I had been doing animal research for 6 years before that on the male rat, by the way. And the year Viagra was approved, I asked the same question that you asked, which is, what's there for women? And I realized there was no approved medications. There was so little research that sought to understand the experiences of women, that women were not getting treatment, and that there was very little teaching about female sexuality. And so that year is the year that I switched and started doing human female sex research. So I would say what I've observed in my career is we've seen some really significant advances, right? We've seen a huge uptick in the number of people who are doing research in female sexuality, huge number of trainees who themselves identify as female, who are doing research in these areas. We're, seeing some advancements in terms of medications, although even that's not great. Even though there are 2 approved medications for low desire, they're not fantastic. They have lots of side effects, but at least there's something for the proportion of women who really want to go that route and use a medication. But I think we're still playing catch up. There's still huge areas of female sexuality that we know very little about. For example, in cancer treatment and cancer surgeries, nerve-sparing radical prostatectomy has been an innovation for a long time, where proactive steps are taken to minimize the negative impact on sexual response. That's barely happening in female surgeries, in particular for cancer. And that's also why the vast majority of cancer survivors after treatment do experience sexual dysfunction. So we've made advances and there's room to grow.
What is your best advice for mothers when they're talking to their daughters who want to kind of break this shackle of it having be more focused on male pleasure and dominance, but also being age appropriate, but wanting their daughters to have a healthy relationship with sex?
Yeah, a great question. And I practice this firsthand with my own kids, where anytime any one of them had a question about sex, I answered it. It did not matter their age. So my view has always been, if they're old enough to ask a question, they're old enough to hear an answer. And obviously you want to tailor it, make it appropriate, that you're not frightening a 4-year-old with images of penis and vagina, because I think for some of them it is kind of scary. But if your child expresses curiosity, use that as an opportunity to talk to them about it. I think defining and practicing and revisiting consent over and over and over is critical. Definitely for those young girls. I'd say even more so for those young boys, because the vast majority of perpetrators are male. The vast majority of victims are female. And so what is happening among those males where they're not soliciting consent actively and openly? So consent conversations is something that as parents we have to be doing, and we do it repeatedly. So I think that's really, really important. And it's an ongoing conversation. So depending on the life stage of your child, you're going to have very different conversations with your 5-year-old, who might be sitting in the bath, enjoying the feelings of pleasure as the water is hitting their genitals, their vulva, their penis, than you are going to be having with your 12-year-old and your 18-year-old. Those are going to be different conversations depending on their social circumstance and emotional development and all those things. Maybe the last thing I'll say about that is, please do not make your child feel bad for self-pleasure and self-touch. Because the number of times that I have had my own clients tell me that, they remember vividly 5 years old, they're in their room, they're touching themselves, it feels good. And a parent walks in and scolds them and tells them they're going to grow hair on their hands and everyone will know that they've been masturbating. And they're kind of left with this message throughout their life that masturbation and self-pleasure are a bad thing. Even though they're an adult now and they're mature and they can see past that, they're still very much impacted from that memory as a child. So masturbation, self-exploration, self-pleasure is totally natural. And so it's an opportunity to have a conversation about where and when, not in the living room or not at the kitchen table. And so I think that's also important to recognize.
I appreciate that honest reflection. I know we're coming up on time, but I want to make sure that women have some things they can try on right away for size. Mindfulness is an amazing practice, but it's unfortunately in this on-demand world we live in, it takes time. It's a practice for a reason. It's going to be a lifelong practice for me, and I bet it is for you too. One of the things that was interesting for me in the book, that was a very small point, but you talked about erotica versus porn and made an important distinction that I quite frankly wasn't aware of. I think a lot of women have kind of a negative perception of porn. I know there's a lot of issues with porn addiction right now, and you really distinguished erotica as a different tool, especially if it's female directed. And I just thought that it was something fresh to think about. And I was wondering if you could explain the distinction.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there is a distinction between pornography and erotica, and traditionally we think of pornography as, something you can access very quickly with your phone, within probably 20 seconds, you can access some pornography. And it tends to be a bit more male focused on male pleasure, subjugating females. There's also questionable ethics involved in terms of, were actors paid? Were they treated fairly? Were they getting screened for sexually transmitted infections? And more often than not, in erotica, those kind of ethical practices are in place where actors are, health measures, health checks are in place and they are compensated. And hence you often have to pay for erotica. And it's because you're paying for the well-being of these entertainers, these actors. So what role might erotica play? So I think it's a great tool. And in the same way that we use other tools in our life to make things happen more efficiently, erotica can also be a tool to turn the mind into a sexual place. And so it's quite different from mindfulness, because mindfulness is about fully paying attention to the here and now, whereas watching an erotic film is about going somewhere else to a sexual place as a way of exciting the mind into arousal. So I think we should be having more conversations about the potential role of erotica for people or for couples as a way of, certainly for people who have a lot of difficulty getting excited in their mind. I recommend erotica all the time. Can also be a fun thing to include as a couple, as a way of introducing novelty too.
Thank you for sharing that distinction. Is there anything in the area of mindfulness and women's sexuality specifically that's on your heart to share as we come to the close that I didn't have a chance to ask you about?
Yeah, I mean, we still have a lot of access issues, right? So there's still very high rates of people with difficulties not getting into those meditation groups, or not getting to see a sex therapist, or not talking to a primary care doctor. So one of the things I and my team have been working on for a number of years is developing a digital tool that delivers our mindful sex program that I describe in Better Sex Through Mindfulness. And we've tested it with hundreds and hundreds of women. We've gotten lots of feedback. We've made improvements. And over the next year or so, we're going to hope to make eSense, which is the name of our digital tool, available for women to use. And I think the value of that is then people can practice anywhere. They can follow this program anywhere they want, right? They can steal away into their car and practice the meditations and get all the educational content. And there's also cognitive behavioral therapy built into a section of eSense as well. So I'm excited about that, because then it means that those people who can't afford to see a sex therapist, or maybe live in an area of their country or province or state where they don't have a provider, or there's other barriers that prevent them, cost often, they can get access to these. So that's one thing personally I and my co-founder and our team are working on right now.
I love that you're working on that to provide access for all those reasons, but also just to bring it full circle. I think a lot of women will still feel taboo and uncomfortable talking to any practitioner about it, but they might be more willing to do a self-guided program. So I'll look forward to seeing more on that. In this area of better sex through mindfulness and women cultivating their own sense of agency and desire in their sexuality, what's one question women could be asking themselves more?
Do I want this? Do I want this? Takes me back to what we said earlier. And maybe that is a good question to ask, because, we are making assumptions that people want to be. So if you can answer that and reflect on the motivations, answering that question also helps you to think about how to make sex more pleasurable, right? So the kind of tactical things helps you think about, what do I need to do to engage my mind to want this more? So it's kind of a silly little question. Do I want this? But it actually could answer a lot of different domains that ultimately lead to more enjoyable sex for you.
I think it's a great question. And I always end my episodes with an opportunity for reflection. So thank you for sharing that. I find your research fascinating. I know that other women in my community are going to want to follow your work and read your book. So where can we find you and support your work?
Yeah. So on social media, you can follow me at Dr. Lori Brotto. So Dr. Dr. Lori Brotto. And on my website, which is loribrotto.com, you can actually download for free many of the meditations that I have recommended in the book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, and the Better Sex Through Mindfulness workbook. And then if anyone is interested in our research program, we often put calls out for research participants, and a lot of the work is remote, so you can live anywhere in the world. That's at UBCSHR. So that stands for University of British Columbia Sexual Health Research.
Dr. Brotto, this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much.
I'm so glad you joined me today. If you're looking for more, feel free to connect with me on Instagram at @WhitneyWoman. And if you enjoyed the show, I invite you to support me by leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Hope you have an inspired day.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience and their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's Libsyn, ads.com today,